tomorrow. This is our March Professional Development event. Today we're going to be hearing from Dr. Dumbaugh, who's a professor at Texas A&M. He specializes in sustainable transportation networks and was recently awarded the best paper for APA for this year, and is going to be sharing with us today about how new urbanism advances mobility and safety goals while building better communities at the same time. So we're excited to have him. Real quickly before Dr. Dumbaugh starts, we got basically two upcoming events I want to let you guys know about. On April 10th, we have our first annual C&U Houston Pub Crawl, and we're going to be starting out, we've narrowed it down, we're going to start out at Hotel Zaza, which is kind of in the museum district, and we're going to take the light rail up from there into downtown and stop at a couple places along the way, and that'll be just a fun social event for everybody, so I hope you guys will think about joining us for that. And then on April 13th, which is the Tuesday following that, April 10th is a Saturday, April 13th is a Tuesday, we're going to have our next implementation meeting. And for those of you who haven't been to one before, our implementation meetings are kind of where we get our hands dirty. It's where we sit around the table and talk about what we need to do next as a chapter and what we can do to impact Houston and advance urbanism here. And so I really hope all of you guys will consider attending our implementation meeting. That's by far your best chance to get involved and become an active member of the chapter. Also, if you're not a member of
here?
No, that'll be, if you put your email on the sign-in sheet that's back here, we'll send you an email that'll tell you exactly when and where. We usually meet at the Black Lab Pub, which is at 3,000 something Montrose. Yeah, but it's basically Montrose and Richmond. And so if you're not a member of C&U, we also have information about joining C&U on the tables in the back, and I'd encourage you guys to take that. Being a member of C&U Houston consists of being a member of C&U National and living in Houston. So if you'd like to join our organization and support us, the very best thing you can do is to join C&U National. And with that, I think we're ready to hear from Dr. Dumbaugh, so you guys can all give a warm welcome to Dr. Dumbaugh.
It's good to be here. Nice to see things moving in Houston. Houston's got a lot going on. It's exciting. What I want to talk about today is transportation, but from a, if you will, non-traditional transportation perspective. You know, I actually did my Ph.D. in civil engineering, but I'm an English major. So I don't know how that fits in, so I do engineering from a weird perspective and can cause grief and aggravation at times. But hopefully you'll agree that we can actually do transportation systems better than we have been doing them. And right now, we've got a lot of professional tensions about how we design our streets. And the tension is between safe and efficient streets, like that we've got depicted on your left, and the civic and social street that new urbanists and urban design folks like those depicted on the right. And when it comes time to allocate portions of the right-of-way to specific uses, it has traditionally been, at least for the last 60, 70 years, the safe and efficient roadway that's dominated, at least for our major thoroughfares. But as it turns out, designing roadways and designing street networks in a form that addresses the civic and social needs can also be used to address safety and mobility needs as well. In short, that there's a win-win approach that can be taken, and what I want to do today is present how that might be. Sure.
Can you move about 3 feet to your right? Sorry, to your left. There you go.
Is it for one? Cool. Actually, I can take you a little more if I. Yeah, that's probably as far as the sports. Good? Sure. So in outlining what we're going to cover today, I want to talk about how we got where we are. If you dig through the historic literature, it's really rather interesting because it was not at all clear that the disconnected suburban subdivision arterial network was the kind of network we would have. It was adopted for the best of reasons, and we sometimes forget why we developed it. We accept it as a given, but going back to the original reason why we designed this is useful for understanding how to move forward and address things we want. And then I want to talk about the two issues that are often a problem when you start talking about alternative street designs, and that's mobility and safety. And I want to conclude a little bit by talking about the trends here, both nationally and in Texas, that are encouraging us to take a more form-based approach to design, so moving beyond traditional functional classification. Now, to understand why we have what we have, we've got to go back to the grid at the beginning of the 20th century. Now, urbanists love the grid, right? We romanticize this as the street network that we seek to embody for its ability to address pedestrians and the like. But at the turn of the century, 1910, 1920s, it was a problem because the grid was never designed to address automobile traffic. It was designed to maximize the number of corner lots we have in our streets. Corner lots were the ones that commanded the most developmental profit because they got the most traffic. So if you wanted to maximize the number of corner lots you had, you simply carried out the grid. It also allowed us to move from planning to platting. Cities like Chicago, like New York, if they wanted to grow, they just expanded the grid ad infinitum. Now, when you're dealing with purely non-motorized forms of travel, this isn't a problem. But it became problematic when we introduced the automobile, because just as these streets were good for carrying pedestrian traffic, they proved pretty nice for automobile traffic too. So when streets got clogged like this one in Chicago, traffic would filter onto the adjacent streets in the street network. So what you wind up getting is automobile traffic entering and diffusing throughout the street network, creating problems for residents there. This is Frederick Law Olmsted Jr. At the turn of the century, 1916 actually here, trying to address the problem of this. And what he said is it's been the tendency of street planners, whether acting for the city or for landowners, to give inadequate attention to the need of the public for main thoroughfares laid out with sole regard to the problems of transportation. What he's complaining about is the grid. The grid is not designed to address modern transportation needs. Now, it turns out he had an alternative that he thought might work, and that was the alternative proposed by his father in the design of Central Park. Now, those of you who have been there know that the way, well, let's take a step back. One of the major design problems that Olmsted Sr. had when designing Central Park was how to deal with cross-traffic from one side of Manhattan to the other. When you're dealing with a park of this magnitude, there's going to be a lot of cross-park traffic. And the concern he had was how do we design this park so that that traffic doesn't undermine the recreational and pastoral purposes of the park itself. A lot of high-speed cross-park traffic would prove problematic for giving folks the recreational pastoral character of the park. So the solution he came up with was transverse roadways. He grade separated the thoroughfares that cross the park. So while the surface of the park has a winding street network, a very rural rustic street network, and pedestrian only, the cross-street traffic was put beneath grade, separated out from the surface of the park so that people using the park wouldn't see it. It also allowed this traffic to move across the park relatively quickly without being impeded by traffic on the surface. Now, I like this graphic because it shows what he intended, right? He actually took the time to sit down and draw the riffraff that he expected to be using these thoroughfares, right? Little orphan waifs and dung carts, right? The indigent. We don't want to see these people in the park. They're going to be racing back and forth. Let's bury them beneath grade. So this was the original design and what it was intended to carry. This is what it carries today, a different form of riffraff. In this case, it's automobiles. But the idea is clear. We can provide different types of thoroughfares. One type of thoroughfare is a recreational type of thoroughfare intended for lower speed pedestrian traffic, and another type of thoroughfare is designed to accommodate automobile traffic and the like. This was carried forward in the first city planning manual. City planning 1916, there needs to be a pronounced differentiation between main thoroughfares intended for traffic carriers and secondary or intermediate ones intended for local development. In other words, we need to start designing streets according to their intended function, right? And we'll know this by this today. This is where the idea of functionally designated streets comes from. The functional classification system that we like to rail on engineers for using was designed by planners, right? And what it says is that we're going to design, you guys are probably already familiar with this, roadways based purely on their traffic function, with high-speed arterial thoroughfares carrying high-speed traffic, and local streets carrying access-related traffic with little throughput, right? This came directly from Central Park, from Olmsted Jr., into this early city planning manuals, and then was embraced by the engineers subsequently. Now, it wasn't enough for planners to begin functionally designing streets for their traffic function. We also started rearranging land uses, too. And we often go to Perry's neighborhood unit as a model for us to emulate today. But I think we often forget one of the major innovations that Perry was promoting here. This was intended to address traffic safety. Now, we still have arterial thoroughfares. They've been pushed out to the boundaries of the community. And what he wanted to do was, with adequate express channels in the circumference of the unit, Through traffic will have no excuse for invading its territory, and its own internal streets can be fairly and deliberately made inconvenient and forbidding with vehicles having no destination within its neighborhood. In other words, by bounding the community with arterial thoroughfares, we can keep this traffic out of the community itself. But that's not all that was going on. It also entails a rearrangement of the lane uses in a community too. Now, community-serving uses, churches and schools, can be kept at the heart of the community. The problem is the retail. What do we do with that? If we include this in the heart of our community, we're going to encourage traffic to enter it. What he proposed was pushing this out onto the junction of the arterials, separating commercial and retail uses from residential uses, pushing them out onto the high-traffic thoroughfares. And if there's any doubt about the development model that Clarence Perry was putting forward, you can see it here. This is a model he proposed in 1939. It comes from Washington, D.C., but it could be just about any strip development we have today. Let's push the retail back from the street, provide plenty of parking so that residents coming in and out of the neighborhood can access these on their way to and from work, and so we can capture pass-by trips from the arterial. This is where the modern subdivision, or the modern strip mall, comes from. It's part of the neighborhood unit concept. It reached its apotheosis in Radburn. Most of us are familiar with this one too. Radburn decided to take this a step further. If Clarence Perry wanted to discourage traffic by providing arterials, Clarence Stein wanted to solve the problem on traffic on residential streets once and for all by putting in residential cul-de-sacs, so that not only would traffic be discouraged from entering residential streets, but there would be no point for them in doing so. And again, this was a traffic safety solution. The gridiron street pattern is as obsolete as a fortified town wall. Every year there are more Americans killed and injured in automobile accidents than the total American war casualties in any year. It's an answer to these conditions that Radburn was formed. It's a traffic safety solution. And we've got the same model. Residential, separated from retail, retail on the major thoroughfares, but now instead of having residential streets that connected, they've been entirely disconnected from the adjacent street network. So what we've got are three guiding design ideas. One, that we're going to design roadways for specific functions. Two, that we should redesign the residential street network to reduce cut-through traffic. And then finally, we should relocate traffic generating uses to arterial thoroughfares. But we've done ourselves one better in this too. We wound up transferring responsibility for the arterial thoroughfares away from urban designers, landscape architects, and planners to the engineering profession. And this happened in a sort of happenstance manner. The problem we had at the turn of the century was the problem of rural traffic. In Texas, you have all these FM roads, farm-to-market roads. And these roads are intended to help farmers carry their goods to market, exactly as the name implies. But in the 19-teens, 1920s, the problem with these roads is they're dirt roads. And as you see in Texas, these dirt roads, when they get a little water, they become impassable. They become worse still when they dry, right? Then they're grooved and rotted and they're impassable. So the concern that we had nationally was how are we going to get the farmers out of the mud? In 1916, the same time the city planning guidebook was first published, we also had the first Federal Highway Act. And this is an act that created bureaus of public roads. And they were created for the express purpose of designing these farm-to-market roads, for paving major regional, state, and national roadways to allow farmers to get their goods to market. They're responsible for the development of state and national highway systems, and their major trade routes throughout a state were included on state highway systems. Now, it's important to recognize your departments of transportation all started as bureaus of public roads, and that many of them still focus on road building is a legacy of this. That DOTs are focused principally on this was ensured when we provided money, a dedicated revenue stream to support mobility-based efforts. In this case, 1932, we adopted a federal gas tax to support state highway systems. We now have agencies in each state with a mandate to address mobility and a funding source that allows them to continue to pursue that mandate. Which is why, when you go through our main streets, you see these types of roadways. This is Palmetto, Georgia, could be Fredericksburg, Texas, could be many of the towns we have. These were the major trade roads that existed at the turn of the century. Your development located on these roadways because of the high amount of traffic that occurred there. But as they became later adopted onto state highway systems, they became designed to state highway system standards. And because the unit of design moved from lower speed pedestrians, draft vehicles, and the like, so automobiles. The design standards of these roadways changed. And a lot of battles you see in Georgia, you see them, I worked in New Jersey, you can see a lot of these, are how do we take these streets and convert them back to lower speed uses that they used to serve. So that's how we got to where we are today. The question becomes, how do we get back to where we want? New urbanists want to go back to the original development model. That there's value to be had in the traditional spaces that we used to build, and the effort is to go back to designing them. Well, today, how we approach arterial design and planning is through a model like this. This is Henry County, Georgia. Could be anywhere in the country, could be Houston, could be anywhere else. What we do is we develop aggregate models that focus solely on arterial roadways, because these are the roadways that we designed to carry our traffic. We identify in the horizon here where congestion is going to be, in this case a two-lane rural roadway, and then we provide capacity for the horizon here. Okay, so we add capacity for that horizon here. And our planners have come around and zoned it for retail and commercial uses. So the retail and commercial uses follow along shortly thereafter, and what we've done is we've undermined our mobility in time by virtue of the disconnect between transportation and land use plan. Now don't blame the engineers for this. We hate these roadways, the strip commercial on the arterials. The engineer never wanted these things to have strip commercial uses. This is a land use problem, and it's a planning problem. This is Bryan, Texas, and here's the zoning ordinance overlaid over that. Planners find these arterial roadways irresistible. They love to take the red crayon and color the lines. I think they're incapable of not doing that, all right? So here what we've done, the land use plan for Bryan, let's color the highways for residential arterial use, which allows us to create a lot of unnecessary access-related traffic on those roadways. Perhaps even more irksome, they spent all this money building a bypass route around the city, and then Texas, another thing I don't understand about Texas is these access roads, right? They don't make any sense, right? So we build a bypass, then we put access roads on them, and then we put retail on them, and what we have is a really terrible commercial street. Anyway, that's what we have to run. But the outcome is that we build ourselves in a corner. Over time, our arterial thoroughfares will transform into this condition. I'm sure you can see it if you get outside the outskirts of Houston, too. You've got your arterial roadway designed all right for a surface arterial thoroughfare, but lined with these strip commercial uses. And this is the type of roadway that does not support multimodal travel very well at all. It's hostile to pedestrians. It's difficult for transit because transit winds up having to compact vehicles to get around. It's not a design that accommodates multimodal travel well. But it's expensive to take more right-of-way. At a certain point, it simply becomes too pricey to add capacity. So you wound up building yourselves in a corner. Now, a lot of the effort today is focused on how do we make these design conditions more pedestrian-friendly. And this is bread and butter new urbanist stuff, right? We add pedestrian-oriented streetscape features, and then we bring the buildings to the street. And now we've got an environment that is a little more conducive to pedestrians, a little easier to access transit on the right-of-way. But it doesn't solve the vehicular mobility problem. We may have designed a street network that works well for other modes, but we do so by neglecting vehicular mobility as well. And a lot of times, and I think it's the wrong way for urbanists to go, we like to fight these pedestrian versus automobile battles. We do it over safety, and we do it over mobility. And if I make one point today, it's that there's a win-win solution. And hopefully you'll come away from this and realize that we can address the needs of transit, the needs of pedestrians, and the needs of motorists all at the same time if we rethink the nature of the problem. The nature of your urban traffic problem, your congestion problem, is what's called control delay. It's delay associated with intersections. The more traffic you have at these intersections, particularly these left turn movements, takes time away from through-moving traffic. The more traffic you load on an intersection, the less efficient it becomes. And when you model level of service for urban streets, that's called control delay. That's what drives your level of service in this environment. We've created a problem where our intersections don't work well by creating a disconnected street network. Our default design, coming straight from the landscape architect and urban design folks, is to design our transportation networks with sparse hierarchy, where we've got an arterial thoroughfare designed to carry all of our traffic. But what we've done is we've designed a network with choke points, right? We've designed a network where all of our traffic is loading onto a handful of intersections. So we've got to take time away from each of those intersections to allow people to filter into it. Which is why, when you take the same amount of lane miles and you put it in a connected network framework, you wind up getting better performance. Because that traffic's able to diffuse. No individual intersection has to carry the same loads as these. The traffic is dispersed. And what we see here, and I think in a lot of these slides you're about to see are from Loudon Jackson, who do some great work on this. What we see here is that your capacity per lane is optimized in a 3-lane configuration. Right? 2 through lanes, 1 in each direction, and then 1 left turn lane to get that left turn traffic out of the through lanes. Adding lanes beyond the 3-lane configuration doesn't get you the same bang for your buck. You're better to have a network of 3-lane roads than multi-lane roads throughout that transportation network. Because as you start adding the extra lanes, you wind up carrying the extra traffic and you wind up having to allocate the extra time to those intersections, especially for your left turns. So if we move away from this arterial thinking and we start thinking in terms of networks, what are the kind of things we can do? In the case of Chattanooga, this runs along the waterfront and connects up to their aquarium. What do we see? Well, the problem they have with this roadway is that choke points were backing up along it. Where the roadway enters the grid, the first intersection fails, then the next intersection fails, and it bleeds on down the roadway. So how do you solve a problem like this? Do you add lanes? Well, what they said was, we could solve this problem by taking lanes. And you might say, well, how can that be? We have a capacity problem. Well, the problem is a problem of sparse hierarchy. Right now, you've got 1,758 vehicles per hour peak. At this point, 2,050 vehicle hours peak up at the top, filtering on down to the network. But if you start punching holes in that network, this traffic can diffuse. Rather than forcing it to load up all into this section of the roadway, it can diffuse down through the network. And after completing this, your road traffic volumes are cut down by more than half, which allows you to pull capacity out of that roadway. So there it is about 6 years ago. Here it is today. Successful, right? It's successful because they took advantage of the grid, right? The grid has a lot of unused capacity. Grid networks are wonderful for this reason. They diffuse and filter traffic and allow us to avoid designing these high volume lanes that don't have any business in urban environments in the first place. So here's before, and what you've got is the aquarium disconnected from the waterfront. Afterwards, they've been able to reclaim their waterfront with a nice promenade in the park, right? And traffic moves better too. This is a win-win solution. Another example, this is Winter Park, Florida. The problem here is you've got 2 arterial thoroughfares, one of which jogs around a super block here. And you can see the problem on the ground. You've got all of this traffic trying to load into this intersection, particularly with the left turn movements, and at peak hour it backs up. The problem, however, is in part a land use problem. How to solve it? Well, first is to recognize that the problem is created by the presence of a super block, where traffic has been forced to channel around a super block. But if you punch holes in the super block, allow traffic to sift through, you can relieve traffic. So the plan for this intersection was to punch the network through, allow that traffic, rather than jogging through 2 left turns, to go straight through. And while you're at it, redesign the land use in a more multimodal configuration. Models for it took it from level of service F to level of service E, or D. Not a great improvement, but an improvement nonetheless, and one that can actually be shifted onto the private sector, right? You simply include this in your land use codes. Well, in places other than Houston, right? So places that do have land use codes. Guess you have deed restrictions, right? So rethinking the problem, you've now got a neighborhood that is multimodal, walkable, pedestrian friendly, and one that moves traffic better too. It's a win-win solution. The big point I want to make is that a lot of our urban mobility problems are as much urban design and operations problem as they are capacity problems. We've historically been too quick to say we need to add capacity to the intersection and not really thought from a systems perspective on how we can address this through means other than capacity. We're going to have to start doing this, and you're going to see more and more of this, and I'm going to tell you why at the end of the lecture. But the point I want to make is we need to start thinking in terms of systems and networks. Because if we start thinking in terms of systems and networks, we can come up with win-win solutions that get us roadways that move traffic and that get us roadways that address multimodalism. The second issue, and this is one where most of my research focuses on, is the issue of safety. Right? If you want to get an engineer really worked up, you tell them this is safe. Right? This violates everything we learn in engineering school. Right? We have made a roadway that is hostile to drivers. If drivers err during the course of traveling, we've got trees for them to run into. They crash and they'll get injured and killed. Deadly. Dangerous. So we tend to prefer roadways that are what we call forgiving, where lanes are wider, so that if drivers deviate a little bit from their intended path, they can correct, where these roadside hazards are eliminated from the right-of-way, so that if they depart from the travel way, there's nothing for them to strike into and get injured. This is a radical departure from the way we used to address safety. This is from 1923, and what we see here are people holding up all the little children to the modern Moloch, to the god of the automobile, right? Gobbling up and killing our children. And it was originally believed that speed was the problem. And that if we're going to make our children safe, we need to reduce speeds. And it's not just urban design folks that said that. The first edition of the Green Book that came out in 1940 expressly cautioned us that wider lanes and shoulders may invite higher speeds, and that higher speeds are a safety problem. This radically changed with the publication of Unsafe at Any Speed in the 1960s. What this book said, we know it because it resulted in the repeal of the Corvair, but it was making a broader philosophical argument that engineers embrace. What it was saying was, we've got an epidemic on our highways. We have focused on addressing driver behavior as the means for addressing safety, so encouraging drivers to go slower. But these drivers are stupid, right? We see this all the time. They talk on their cell phones, they behave foolishly. We need to just begin assuming that drivers are going to make mistakes when they drive. We ought to assume that drivers are going to depart the travel way, run off the roadway, and crash into objects. In other words, we ought to treat it the same way we address epidemiology. I need to start addressing the environmental sources of hazards and injuries. Stop trying to get the driver to change their behavior and start designing the roadway to avoid the injuries. So let's eliminate the environmental sources of injuries and fatalities. The publication of this led to a series of AASHTO Senate safety hearings. They were actually called AASHTO in '66. They became transportation officials in the '70s, but state highway officials in '66 held a series of safety hearings to figure out how we can deal with this epidemic on the highways. Now, we didn't have an incident. We didn't have any systematic means of collecting safety data the way we do today. But we did have some rough data. What did we find? We found that interstates reported fewer crashes than other roadway types. Now, this was fundamentally a surprising thing, because the interstate wasn't intended to be a safe facility. It was intended to be a fast one, right? The objective of the interstate system, Interstate Highway and Defense Act, was to allow high-speed traffic to travel from one end of the country to the other. Wide lanes. The shoulders were never designed as safety features. They were intended as breakdown lanes to get vehicles off the roadway so that through-moving traffic could move. That is also proved to be safer was a eureka moment, right? Because that wasn't the intention. It seemed like this could really be a win-win. Why would it be the case? These things designed for speed also proved to be safer. Well, if you adopt the perspective that the driver is a fool, it makes perfect sense, right? These roadways are forgiving to error. If a driver departs from the travel way, there's extra room, extra width for them to correct prior to crashing into something. So it resulted in the conclusion that we have today, that the use of high design values, so high design speeds, wider lanes, and shoulders, are safety enhancements, right? And you see this in the testimony that came out at the time. Even if people have accidents, even if they make mistakes, even if they're looking out of a window or they're drunk, we should have a second line of defense for these people. The sequence of events that leads to an accident injury can be broken by engineering countermeasures even before there's a complete understanding of the causal chain. Two ideas here. One is one we learned in engineering school, and that's the concept of the design driver. The person we're designing for is the person that's most prone to error. Now, when I was in engineering school, the concept was defined as a little old lady driving at night after a few drinks on an unfamiliar road in the rain, right? But the same idea here. Designing for drunks, looking out the window, not paying attention for the roadway. Let's design for fools. Let's make the fool the unit of design. The second issue is one that, at least as a researcher, causes me heartburn. We don't even have to know why crashes are occurring. We can ignore the causal factors that lead to crashes. We should simply begin adopting engineering countermeasures under the assumption that the crash will occur, and that in so doing our roadways will be safer. We can eliminate any consideration of driver behavior. All right? This came forward by Kenneth Stonex. He was originally hired by General Motors to design safe roadways because then General Motors didn't want to put safety features in their vehicles. So he created something known as a proving ground. Roadways with 100-foot shoulders, right? And they would drive vehicles off at 60 miles an hour to see how far they'd go before they'd stop. Well, he was a safety expert at the time because we didn't have very many. And he came and testified. And what he said was, hey, we've got to design and operate the 90% or more of our surface streets just as we do our freeways, converting the surface, highway, and street network to freeway road and roadside conditions. Now, if you get a Lifetime Achievement Award from the Transportation Research Board for doing safety, it's named after this guy. So those of us who are the best people in doing safety improvements will end our careers receiving the Kenneth A. Stonex Award. He was profoundly influential in the way the transportation engineering profession does safety. We see this in the manuals. Highways built with high design standards put the traveler in an environment that's fundamentally safer because it's more likely to compensate for the driving errors he will eventually make. Right? Drivers are going to be fools, let's make the roadway forgiving. More modern editions, we have the same idea. Every effort should be made to use as high a design speed as practical to attain a desired degree of safety. High design speeds translate to the use of wider features for lane shoulders and clear zones. The higher the design speed, the wider the geometric features of a roadway. So what we've got is a design philosophy based on 3 ideas. One, and most of us I think will agree with this. Even driving around here, I had a little time to cruise around over Kirby before I came to the meeting today. You see people, they're on the phone, they're cutting in lanes, right? Drivers are going to err, they're going to make mistakes, and they're going to behave in behaviors that result in crashes and injuries. The second premise is that driver errors are random and unpreventable, that you can't stop drivers from making mistakes. Thus, the third is that the best strategy then is for addressing driver errors is to ensure that all roadways are forgiving to them when they inevitably occur. All right? So the logical conclusion is the one that I was trained in, that I was trained in. We enhance safety by widening lane shoulders and clear zones. Now the presumption, again, is that runoff roadway events, these roadways that cause us to design our road signs for automobiles, are random and unpreventable. And if this is true, then you would expect this sort of encroachment event to be constant. And this is what we use in things like the roadside program to estimate the likelihood of crashes that occur. But the question then is, well, what about urban areas? The data used to support the application of clear zones in urban areas is this one here. It compares Huntsville, Alabama, not exactly a pinnacle of urbanism, to a rural environment. And what they find in both cases is that the majority of crashes, roughly 90%, 80%, occur within 30 feet of the right-of-way. So the conclusion they derive from this is that if we eliminated all trees within 30 feet of the right-of-way, we can also eliminate the majority of roadside crashes as well. So I decided in my dissertation work to reinvestigate this. Because again, I'm an English major. What do I know, right? It didn't make sense to me. It's in a manual. I don't see it when you go to these streets. So I figured I'd go out to urban areas, do some field measurements, and figure out what's really going on. I took streets. These are actually in Central Florida. DeLand, Ocala were the communities I looked at. But I looked at arterial roadways that traveled the entire length of the metropolitan area. I went out and I field measured all the geometric features, and all of them had traditional urban environments along the core. And I did the same thing. I measured the distance between roadside fixed objects and clear zones. And I found about the same thing. More than 80% of these crashes occurred within 20 feet of the right-of-way. Does that mean the original study's conclusion was right? That we should eliminate all of these trees adjacent to the right-of-way? Well, no, that struck me as kind of foolish, right? Because most of these streets didn't have 20-foot clear zones, right? So I also plotted out the percentage of streets with clear zones in different widths. And what we see here is that the probability that somebody's going to crash into a tree with a given clear zone width is constant no matter what the width is. you're just as likely to crash into a tree with a 20-foot offset as you are to crash into one with a 5-foot offset. The probability is fixed. Stated another way, the low incidence of crashes on streets with wide clear zones is solely a function of the fact that there aren't very many streets with wide clear zones. All right? Now, we've got other tricks in our sleeve in engineering school, right? We like to use statistical modeling. And I'll try not to make this too boring, but I wanted to see how different roadside safety features affected crash incidents. And I controlled for the things you normally want to control for: traffic volume, speed limits, number of lanes, lane widths, median widths, all this stuff that can affect safety. But I also modeled paved shoulder width, unpaved fixed object offset, so the setback of the tree from the edge of the paved portion, and then a dummy variable that accounted for the fact whether or not a livable street treatment was present, so streetscape features, sidewalks, and the like. Now, if we're going to make a claim that a roadway is safe, right, that a roadside feature is safe, we've got to make a couple of statements. First, it's got to have fewer roadside crashes, right? But these roadside crashes shouldn't be replaced by increases in other crash types, right? So if you eliminate 3 tree crashes, but you add 20 multiple vehicle crashes, it's hard to assert that the roadway is safer, right? We do that, but we shouldn't. I modeled both. I was only able to model, well, we'll get into this in a second. I wasn't able to model fatal because our livable streets didn't have any fatalities, but I stole a punchline for later. That's okay. So the model results. Well, shoulders, and we engineers like shoulders, these nonetheless were consistently associated with increases in crashes, whether they were roadside crashes or whether they were mid-block crashes. Now, they didn't enter statistically significant levels, but nonetheless the association was positive. It certainly wasn't this negative and significant effect that you would expect if passive safety theory was true. It was the exact opposite relationship. Wider fixed object offsets were associated with decreases in fixed object crashes, but actually resulted in no net effect of mid-block crashes. Stated another way, there may have been a fewer tree-related crashes or pole-related crashes, but that was offset by an increase in multiple vehicle crashes. Stated another way, there was no net safety gain as the result of providing clear zones. The only feature that was consistently associated with a significant reduction in both roadside and mid-block crashes were these livable street treatments. Across the board, fewer total crashes, fewer roadside crashes, fewer injurious crashes, fewer mid-block crashes, fewer injurious mid-block crashes. No matter how you measure safety, they're safer. Right? The only roadside treatment that consistently shown to do so. And you might ask, well, how much safer? I'll tell you. Per vehicle mile traveled, there were 40% fewer mid-block crashes, 67% fewer roadside crashes. So, even though you've got not one but 2 rows of deadly trees, nobody's crashing into them. Further, not a single injurious fixed object crash occurred in the livable sections during the 5-year period, nor was there a single fatality involving either a pedestrian or a motorist. Right? And again, if we measure safety in terms of the incidence of crashes, injuries, and deaths, and not in terms of our ability to meet a theoretical design condition, we must then agree that the roadway with fewer crashes is the safer roadway, regardless of the theory you use. Some of us like evidence and not theory. Theory should support evidence, and not the other way around. All right, so what's going on here? The passive safety theory ain't working, right? Pushing this stuff back isn't making it safer. Well, it's kind of fun. You go out and you do field measurements, and you sort of, you feel like you're CSI, right? So you've got the crash reports, and you're trying to reconstruct what happened. And I got to do this for a couple of weeks out in the field, and it's like here, actually. South Central Florida is a lot like this place in February, March. It's pleasant. Well, except for this last February, right, where it was freezing. It was like Seattle here. But it's generally the weather's pretty pleasant, so it was a nice time. After about 3 or 4 days, I started figuring out what was going on, and it was a eureka moment, right? Well, first of all, let's examine these crash locations. Let's not use a theory, so I went out and examined these things. Most of the crashes took a very specific form, and that form was this. You have a fixed object located at the back end of the driveway or curb on a roadway designed for higher speeds. You have a driver, prior to the crash, attempting to negotiate turn onto that street. 83% of all tree and pole crashes occurring there occurred at this location, the overwhelming majority. What's going on is we're telling drivers on our arterial thoroughfares, hey, you guys can tear it up. 45 miles an hour, 55 miles an hour, no problem, right? Except our driveways and side streets aren't designed to allow us to negotiate turns at the high speed that the arterial tells us to drive. If you decelerate, the people behind you come up on you. How dare you? So you wind up attempting to negotiate these turns at speeds that don't allow you to safely negotiate them. So what do you wind up doing? You wind up encroaching on the back end of a driveway or curb. So you wind up hitting this object, right? And it doesn't matter whether it's located here or 30 feet back. What matters is your trajectory on that turn. The probability of striking it anywhere in this zone is exactly the same. The design condition is different. Right? The systematic pattern here. This isn't random at all. This is systematic. It's embedded in the design of the roadway. Higher operating speeds on the arterial, an attempt to turn onto a driveway or side street, which results in encroachment at the back end of the driveway or curb. Which means we need to distinguish between two types of errors. Nobody can disagree that drivers behave like fools. They do. We can see it, and I'm sure we'll see it tonight. Some of us may even be those fools, right? Humans will err, and roadways should be forgiving when they do. That's the theory we have. It encourages us to strive for a single fail-safe solution. However, there's another perspective, and that's the systematic error perspective, one that we don't design for. And that says that the errors that lead to crashes are the result of the design itself. That we can design environments that make crashes more likely to occur, that encourage people to create errors. Stated another way, a lot of our designs are like putting a bullet in the chamber of a gun and then handing it to someone. All the conditions are set. All that's needed is for somebody to pull the trigger. Everything is set up. When you have the high-speed arterial with the driveways and side streets, you've loaded the gun and put the bullet in the chamber. All right, which suggests we need to rethink urban roadside safety, or urban road safety. A safe design is one that eliminates systematic error while also reducing the consequences of random error. Now, this is a tough bar to meet, but I would assert to you that it can be done. And there are a couple ways to do this. One is the way we do on our interstates. And I'll explain what that is. And then the second, the one that we as engineers need to start adding to our design palette, is the livable street approach. And no matter how you slice it, interstates, for the most part, are safe roadways. And they're safe, both for the reason we assume, they're forgiving by design. They've got wide lanes and wide shoulders that are forgiving to errors when they occur. But what we've overlooked is that they also address the problems of systematic error too. A lot of the problems we have on urban streets is that you've got people jockeying in and out of driveways. That's eliminated on these roadways by limited access. Those turning maneuvers that cause people to run off the roadway are addressed here through the use of on-ramps and deceleration lanes. Right? We're able to gradually decelerate down a curve. We may also have a yellow sign that tells us what speed we got to do that at. It becomes more transparent what the behavior is. Access management. You don't see a lot of this in Texas, but you have a lot of it in Florida, where you try to control the access on a roadway with medians, deceleration lanes, and the like. These things are safe. They're great. They're a suburban road treatment, but they're good from a safety perspective. They separate out access from the roadway. They provide deceleration lanes that allow people to decelerate rather than traveling through the through lane. And so they have the same design conditions. Higher speeds, few driveways and side streets, and deceleration lanes. Our problem is this type of roadway, the suburban arterial, where we don't limit access. And this is actually our default design condition. These are actually okay, because traffic's so bad, you go kind of slow out there. That's going about 20, 25, which isn't bad for an urban street. But if you look at the crash record on streets like this, they're through the roof. Compared to the livable streets we saw, this street has 4 times the roadside crashes, despite the fact that objects are pushed back 5, 6 feet, right? They've also got 4 times the mid-block, an injurious mid-block crashes, multiple vehicle crashes as well. And when you look at the distribution of crash types, all of them, well 65% of them rather, are attributed to the intermingling of access and speed. We've tried to have a high-speed roadway and an access roadway at the same time. And as soon as you do that, you've created a condition that's a recipe for a disaster. Because high-speed traffic traveling through an arterial thoroughfare has a more difficult time braking for vehicles turning in and out of driveways or pedestrians crossing the street. They become less able to do that. You create an unsafe condition as a result. Now, as part of the study that that won the award from APA, I actually went out with San Antonio and figured out how much more dangerous these things are. Each additional mile of arterial thoroughfare in your community results in a 15% increase in total crashes, 17% increase in injuries, and a 20% increase in fatal crashes. Want to make your roadway more dangerous? Add more arterials. Problem solved. Strip commercial uses. And this is after controlling for traffic volumes. Each additional strip commercial use is associated with a 1.3% increase in total crashes and a 1.1% increase in injuries. And they're agglomerative. You want to drive up your accident tally. And frankly, on one hand, I kind of like it because it provides work for me, right? Yeah. I guess that joke wasn't fun. All right. I like data, right? So I get to see, I don't have to see it, I get to look at the data. Anyway, you add these, and this is the percent increase that occurs with each additional strip commercial use added to a roadway. Big box stores, same thing, same effect, but because they're bigger, the effect is even bigger. 6.6% increase in total crashes and a 4% increase in interest crashes. However, the other issue with big box stores is that there's a lot of off-network traffic too, because you've got to provide circulation lanes for all that traffic that's pulling in and parking. We don't look at that in safety analyses. We just look at the public right-of-way. I wanted to figure out how much of these crashes were occurring off-network in things like driveways and circulation lanes for San Antonio. Oops. There we go. In the case of San Antonio, 13% of all the crashes that were occurring occurred off-network. More than 1 out of 10. We don't even count them when we don't analyze them. 9% of the injuries, 16% of the fatalities. Pretty amazing, huh? And a lot of them are people running over their kids in driveways. So that's one source of them. But that's where the fatalities are occurring off-network. An alternative approach is the one we need to add to our palette, which is the livable street approach. Now, these roadways are unforgiving by design. You leave the travelway on one of these roadways, and you'll strike something that will hurt you. However, the hazard is obvious. Most people don't get in their cars and want to die. On any given year, there's about 50 traffic-related fatalities where people go out, walk into a street, or jump off a bridge and kill themselves. Right? 50. There's roughly 40,000 people that die each year, which suggests to you that 39,550 people got killed that didn't want to die. All right? And people are pretty amazing. They say, if I run into one of these trees, I'm going to get hurt. So I'm going to try not to run into the tree. On the case of this roadway, it's a 45-mile-per-hour approach. I measured the speed through this section. The speed dropped down to about an average of 28 miles an hour. Perfect. People saw this roadway, and it's a 14-foot lane. You can tear it up through there if you want to. But the environment tells you not to. So you don't. People go at lower speeds. Now, these are unforgiving by design, but the hazards here are obvious and expected. And people engage in behavioral compensations to minimize their exposure to hazard and injury. So it reduces systematic error, because turning movements that can cause tree-related crashes are accommodated by the lower speed. It also reduces the likelihood of crashing into another vehicle or a pedestrian, because at lower speeds you can brake more quickly. You're better able to respond. Moreover, as we're seeing in the environmental psychology literature, people are more attentive in environments that have rich roadside environments. The environments tell them to look out for pedestrians and other cars, and people respond by doing that. So it addresses the systematic error, but what about the random error? What about drivers that make mistakes? Well, we need to go back to the basic physics stuff we learned, right? What causes the injury and the death is the amount of force that's absorbed in an impact. And that force is a function of the speed of the vehicle at impact. So if you reduce speed, you reduce the force that's absorbed in the impact, and you make a roadway that is inherently more forgiving, because the amount of force that's absorbed in that impact event is less. It's forgiving by design because of the lower speed. All right. So the argument I would make to you is that through good urban design, by paying attention to urban areas and the characteristics of urban areas, we can get mobility and we can get safety. We can do a better job than we traditionally have done. But you're not going to do it for that reason. You're going to do it. Texas is going to have to do it. Nationally, we're going to have to do it. But we're not going to do it because it works better. We're not going to do it because it's more sustainable. We're not going to do it because it's the right thing. We're going to do it because we're broke. All right? You can see this in Pennsylvania. They've got the same problem everybody else does. Vehicle hours of delay is going up. Vehicle hours travel is going up. VMT is going up. However, unlike places like Houston, their population really isn't growing. So they're getting all these problems that growing places have without population growth. They've also got the problem that you've heard TxDOT complaining about, which we don't have enough money. The gas tax is broken. We can't afford to do our projects anymore. In this case, Pennsylvania actually had a gap between the amount they needed simply to maintain the highways and bridges and the amount that was available, which caused them to sit back and reassess what they were doing. Well, what was the cause of the problem? Well, part of the problem was that material costs have started going through the roof. It's more expensive, markedly more expensive to build something now than it was just 5, 6 years ago. Costs have doubled and tripled for things like concrete, steel, and asphalt. And it's not just Pennsylvania. It's not that these things are more expensive in Pennsylvania. They're more expensive nationally. National trends. We see the same thing. All of these materials are a lot more expensive to buy today than they were a few years ago. And the reason is because there's increased competition for them. China is in the process of building its own interstate highway system. 85,000 kilometers, roughly 60,000 miles of highway, equivalent to the U.S. interstate highway system. They're committed to doing this, and they need it. It's part of their industrialization. But that means that there's greater competition for transportation-related materials. And when materials become more scarce, price goes up. This is going to be going on for another 20 years. Regardless of whether we fix or don't fix the gas tax, material costs still cost 2 to 3 times more than they did just a few years ago. The problem's even bigger. India wants to be a first world country too. And they know that to do that, they need to start providing an interstate highway system of their own. Right now, India is connected up largely by 2-lane rural roadways. They need to add their capacity. The problem is further compounded, and that now, Tata Motors has created a $2,500 car, which means that the roughly 300 million people in India's middle class can now afford an automobile. These folks were getting by on bikes, on two-wheelers, some mopeds and the like. Now there's increased automobile usage there, and there's going to need to be automobile infrastructure to accommodate it, which means there's going to be more competition for the same materials that are causing costs to go up. Now, you would expect the trend for costs to continue going up as India begins mobilizing its highway system as well. Now, there are a couple things you can do. I came from Georgia Tech prior to here. And one of the things you can do is you can do the ostrich approach, right? Where you put your head in your sand, you pretend you can get around the problem through innovative finance. So Georgia, in its infinite wisdom, decided to do a bunch of grant anticipated revenue bond funding. So they want to build highway projects now by floating bonds for it, but they're not addressing the inherent problem that they have. These bonds, when they issue them, aren't buying the same amount of stuff they would have bought a few years ago. And what we're actually seeing is that a lot of this money is going to operations and maintenance purposes rather than new capital improvements they intended. They're in for trouble. They're committed, I think, roughly 15 to 20% of their total federal transportation dollars for the next 20 years for projects, and they're not getting the transportation benefits they expected from them. You could do that, pass the problem on to future generations, or you can do what PennDOT's trying to do, which is rethink the problem. We can't afford to do what we used to be doing. What can we do in its stead? Well, they looked at the nature of what's going on. We don't have a lot of growth in Pennsylvania, but we've got a lot of sprawl. Our metro areas are sprawling, and they're doing it in part because our transportation system incentivizes. We provide highways, and we get a thin veneer of strip development along the corridor. What they said was, we need to begin discouraging this development from happening. We need to begin having this development occur in compact centers in major transportation nodes and preserving the integrity and mobility use of that corridor itself. In other words, what they're doing is they're making their transportation problem a land use problem. We'll skip that for time. The key ideas here: one, we have to focus on safety, and efficient doesn't mean safe. Right now we play this game that we can have a safe and efficient roadway, and in urban areas that's not necessarily true. And that we can address mobility through land use and urban design. That we ought to be designing environments that maximize mobility. Not by enhancing throughput, but by reducing travel demand overall. And then prioritize operations and maintenance. They've come out with a plan, sound land use implementation plan that they're using in evaluating projects, and they have actually transect coded their metropolitan areas. In this case, this is Philadelphia. crosses 2 states. They have transect coded it. The DOT, right? The Department of Transportation. Because to get the transportation solutions they need to pay attention to the environment in which they're being placed. And what are they using? Well, they're trying to link roadway design to urban form. And we have a new manual that lets us do that, although most of us have been aware of this thing for the last 5 years, right? It's been floating around since 2006, recently passed. Used to have a much more unwieldy name. But designing walkable urban thoroughfares is a context-sensitive approach, which gives us design specifications for mobility-oriented streets that work in an urban environment. Your urban avenue and your commercial street. And you might say, well, fine, Dumbaugh, that ain't the way we do things in here in Texas, right? And I saw, about a year or two ago, I saw a design for Kirby and Westheimer, right? And I was impressed with this because it seemed like a Texas solution, right? If you want to make anything better in Texas, put a star in it, right? Well, I'd suggest to you that business is changing in Texas. Back in 2007, Texas Transportation Commission authorized the Texas Urban Thoroughfares Committee. Some of you may know about this. It was pushed forward by Mike Crucy, Scott Polikoff, who's based out of Dallas, but he's all over the state, really pushed this thing forward. I served on it. We were tasked with coming up with alternative ways for TxDOT to engage in business practices. And what came out of that were a couple things, and I won't go through all of this. But what came out of it was we need to have more attention to our stakeholders as part of the planning process. And we need to start including local land use plans when we engage in design. So we ought to bring our stakeholders, both community stakeholders and local planning documents, into the very beginning of the planning and design process. In other words, we need to be more context sensitive about the way we do this, and we need to start thinking beyond simple mobility needs. But this is really exciting too, and this is, I would argue that Texas is one of the leaders in the country because of this. They also actually adopted this manual back last June, right back when it was just an ITE recommended practice. Texas adopted this manual as design policy before ITE adopted it as a design policy. You've now got this in the state of Texas as a working document that you can refer to. I'm not sure at this point how it's trickled down the organizational layers in the Texas Department of Transportation. But when you hit a TxDOT project, refer to it. It's been authorized by the Texas Transportation Commission. It's an adopted design manual in the state of Texas, which gives you design specifications for creating urban avenues and commercial streets, something we didn't have before. There's been a training component that we've proposed as part of this, and I haven't heard where that's going in a while. But ideally, there will be training to train TxDOT staff at the district level on how to actually implement these design guidelines in practice. Texas is way ahead of the rest of the country on this. And it's an exciting time to be here. So what I would conclude with is that there are 2 possible futures. The first is that we can continue with our current practices, and what we're going to wind up having is crumbling infrastructure. We're deferring maintenance, we're deferring improvements that we need to do on our system to add capacity. We can't afford to do it anymore. Sooner or later, every state's going to have to come to terms with the fact that we don't have the budget to do the stuff we've been doing for the last 50, 60 years. The money's not there anymore. The question then becomes, well, what do we do? Do we keep trying to add new capacity at the expense of the stuff that exists, or do we start rethinking our approach? And I would argue to you that this is a better scenario than that. According to the Brookings Institute, half of the built environment that will exist in 2030 will be new. It didn't exist in 2000. And if you think about that, in our lifetimes, we're going to have the ability to shape half of the development in this country, for good or ill. And it's an amazing challenge to deal with. We can't afford just to take care of what we've got. We've got to come up with a new way to design this. And capacity, well, I would argue that you want to focus on providing solutions that move traffic. It's only part of the solution. And it's one that we're increasingly hard-pressed to afford. Urban design is going to be the way out of this. We've got to return to understanding how environments work and designing them to work. We need to realize that most solutions, particularly urban areas, are going to have to be multimodal. We're going to have to reduce our reliance on automobile travel because we can't afford to rely on it anymore. So with that, there's a lot more I can do. Hopefully I kept this within the time parameters. I'll conclude. My contact information's up there if you want to reach me. And with that, I'll conclude. Questions?
Is this presentation available?
I think it will be.
We're going to post the video.
Today's videotaping it, and I think we'll put a copy on the CAU website if that's all right.
Yeah, it'd be fine. Be glad to have you have it.
San Antonio and Austin have high-speed center lanes, sometimes raised, so they're not having to buy new frontage left and right, which they don't have. Does this, and then so the lower, slower for turns into the, does that help any? Did you notice that?
I'm not sure. I'm not really that. I know downtown Austin a little bit.
You know, by the Capitol, or close by.
Right.
You know, through
With that
lanes.
double-decker highway?
Yeah, double-decker highway. And
Can't
San
cross
Antonio
that
too.
thing.
Through
I would
little
suggest
towns.
to you that that probably is not the solution that we should be focusing on. Double-decker highway, and also, I've driven across it. The problem with, and I'm sort of, I don't really know it that well, but the problem with that seems to be that you can't get across it one way or the other. The access connections there are terrible.
Yeah, they have alternate, you know, high-speed spots, several of them dispersed, and more slow-speed stops on the lower one for left-right crossings.
Okay.
Anyway, I just drive it. I think it's neat.
Yeah. My impression of it driving across it is that it really sort of cuts through the city and divides it into two halves. But again, I've been on it 2 or 3 times, mostly just to go in and park. So I don't know it real well.
That stretch actually of 35 has been the most had the most fatalities of any urban road in several years in the last decade. So it's one of the most dangerous roads in the country.
Yeah, probably. Well, the same I
But I think it has to do with the access or something.
Getting across. And actually, the Chronicle, I saw this, I guess about a year and a half ago, that actually half the pedestrian fatalities here in Houston are on your interstates, which I found stunning. But that's what happens when you've got apartments on one side, retail on the other, and the nearest connection is a mile up. I mean, people are going to take that risk and try to cross the roadway. Yeah. Sure. That was the first one.
Eric, a couple things. The presentation was great. Thank you very much. TxDOT's wrestling with CSS. There is an aspect of it that almost requires you to be kind of an urban architect, urban planner in a way. And a lot of folks just have trouble just seeing it. Much less translated on the paper. And Hurricane Ike here, I think, did a good job of demonstrating to people that no matter if you had 4, 6, 8-lane roadways, everything came forward stopped because we had no power for the signals. So the lanes didn't help you, and I think you pointed that as well. I think the challenge is going to be, and I'm seeing it at IT at a national level, like you talked about, it's almost generational. If I came of age when the car was king, or I was brought up by someone who came of age who was my mentor when the car was king, it's kind of challenging for a lot of folks. And it's almost 2 camps. It really doesn't have to be. But I think the important point is traffic is all of the ways. Pedestrians, transit riders, bicyclists, motorists, and ridden and herded animals under Texas state law.
Yeah, no, that's right. I mean, and that's why Scott Polakov is still trying to push this forward, but the training program is key to getting operational folks into that. We at Texas A&M are in the process of putting together an executive level certificate program that will cover transportation and urban design. We're figuring out the logistics of it, but it's something that we want to be able to offer remotely to folks that are interested, either through field visits or through some type of online learning. But training is key because it's not included in most engineering programs. But most of our problems, particularly with the rate of urbanization we have, both in the United States and especially internationally, I mean, our problems are going to be urban transportation problems, and there's going to be the people who can address these types of problems are the people that have a very strong future in transportation. So yeah, I mean, we see that at Texas A&M, we see that as an opportunity area for what we're doing. But yeah, I agree. I mean, it's going to be a training issue, and the next generation gets it. I mean, the kids that are 20, 25, not that much older than that, so maybe I shouldn't say that. But I mean, they fundamentally get it. They come in engineering students, planning students. They grew up watching Friends, right? How cool is that to have a coffee shop bottom of your building? Like, they get urbanism, whereas I grew up and it was sort of the ghetto, right? You didn't go to the city; it was frightening. But the mentality, people are starting to get cities, and there's a lot of interest in it. And it's an exciting time. It's a real exciting time to do it. Yeah.
Well, I think part of what I'm hearing with Gary and what I'm hearing with you is what we're really trying to do is we're trying to create a cultural change within the people that are making the decisions. And that here in Houston, that tends to be, well, it's more important what we're putting under the roads. The sewers and the storm drains, the water lines almost take the focus on roadway design as opposed to the rest of it. How do you go about facilitating that cultural change?
Well, it comes to the issue where, and I guess this intersection reading about Westheimer and Kirby, it comes to the issue where you've got local demand for different types of projects, or you've got level of service, transportation problems that you simply can't solve, you can't have right away. And my guess is that it's going to have to start with addressing these local level problems, either through addressing stakeholders or through solving micro-scale solutions. But when you start doing that, you start building up a track record of success on that, then you can build into a larger program and you can change the culture. But the key thing is to start getting those things that you can point at.
So choose your projects.
Yeah, be strategic about the projects you choose. Because once you, my sense is that once places figure out how things work, once you see a better approach, it's hard to go back to one that is less effective. If you can do something that your stakeholders are happier with, that costs less money, and that is more effective overall, it's hard to go back to doing something that's less efficient unless you're really, really stubborn. Go for success, go for the goal. Once you have that, but the nice thing is then you can leverage that. You can point at that and say it worked here, it can work there too. A lot of times, Charlotte, for example, is a great case of this, where Charlotte's actually gone forward and done alternate street design standards. We can point to Portland all the time and say, well, yeah, but Portland's Portland, that doesn't apply. You get a conservative city like Charlotte, right, that's doing really alternative stuff, and you can say, if Charlotte can do it, why can't we do it here? Portland, we say, is a unique case, although Portland's lovely. It's getting those examples you can point at, but places, even here with all the urbanization I saw going in through here, you're going to wind up hitting these problems pretty soon if you haven't already, and once you start getting the solutions to focus on, you'll have something you can build off of. Yeah.
You focused a lot on the decisions that folks in public sector make that directly impact these designs. But in Houston, and I think in Texas generally, the private sector also tends to have a lot to say about this. And retail developers in particular are quite wed to this ideal of the very high speed, very high volume arterial street with a driveway in front of every store. And that's what you should be striving for, and that's what public policy should be trying to create. I'm curious as to whether you presented this at all to developers, real estate community, and had any reaction.
Actually, I don't know that I would agree that the real estate community is our problem. Once again, it's the same kind of thing that once there's a track record of success, they move forward with that. South Florida, that I'm very familiar with, they don't put script stuff in anymore because it's done. It's the lifestyle centers that work. You still want that mobility, so you'll see the stuff going on the intersection of two major arterials, but then they internalize it, so you'll have some very stringently access-controlled access into that, but once you filter off the arterials, it's a lower speed. It's essentially an urban street network. The lifestyle centers are the things that are having the higher occupancy rates, that are commanding the higher dollar values in the market. And real estate developers see this, and they say and actually this is something Andrew could probably speak to better than I can, but it's the same kind of thing. When you see something that commands more money, commands higher retail real estate premiums, that's the stuff you start moving for. Florida, you're not going to see the strip stuff go anymore because there's no market for it. Well, there's not much of a market for anything down there anymore. But the retail stuff that's survived and done reasonably well are the lifestyle centers. There's I think he's based out of California. His name is Friedman. I was on a panel with him once. I can't remember his first name. But he's actually presented a whole thing. The future of real estate development is moving away from the script. He wrote a report that came out just this week for EPA, their smart growth division, that talks about all of this from the real estate perspective. Retailers around the country, it started on the coast, but it's moving in, are going for lifestyle center configurations. The real estate challenge is actually what do you do with the declining strips? They're tough, because they're not, what else do you put there? Retail doesn't want to be there anymore. They want to build the civic realm so they can command the higher retail values. Residents don't want to live there. Nobody wants to live on a
daycare centers. Daycare centers.
Daycare centers. Good for schools, right? They like to go for the cheap land too, right? that's the real. I don't know what the solution to that is, but that's the real challenge in the future. Yeah.
We designed and built a freeway down Furnace Road, right in Houston, called 288 South Freeway. Now they're going back to Burger in Maryland with Furnace Road. I don't know why. All I can tell you is they seem to feel like the adjoining landowners down there have a right to access the highway.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, you've
Almost
got
like the freeways get built with the idea of providing better retail access.
I mean, the problem is people run the retail models, and they're like, look at all this traffic on this, we want to be able to access that. But truthfully, you can't access it very well from the access lane. You've created a disaster. Not only that, but then you've got to start putting these signalized intersections in, and you've got a lot of left turn movements associated with people trying to get to just the other access lane the opposite direction. I mean, the way to think about these things is you've got your, don't have a mark, I like to draw. Yeah, I don't draw well. But you've got your arterial. You ought to start thinking about those intersecting roads as really being an opportunity. Building along those corridors, we sort of think too small, right? I mean, all the way down these arterials that intersect with your highway, they've got great access to the highway system. I mean, they've already got it. You just have to stretch out a little further. I mean, you can access a half mile down an arterial roadway. You can access the highway a lot easier than you can riding a mile up the access road, then trying to whip around and go a mile back. And it's also more operationally efficient because then you don't need all these U-turns clogging up your intersections.
Several years ago, there actually was a huge battle in Texas where TxDOT actually said, we're not going to add frontage roads to the new freeway we're building. And the local municipalities revolted and caused TxDOT to go back because they were afraid it would completely screw their development chances.
They were looking at the strip.
Right, they want the retail revenue.
As opposed to having a good baggage road system that was parallel.
Yeah.
That fed it from a rural across the freeway.
But or you do it perpendicular.
Yeah.
Your slide that showed 2, 3, 4 lane configurations and the efficiency. I was wondering if European-style roundabouts were considered, or if they weren't, what would be your rough estimate?
No, that was simply a measure of control delay, a measure of intersection capacity, and signalized intersection. Roundabouts are nice. The other one I can think of, at least where I'm at, is they're trying to do lifestyle centers in Bryan College Station, and one of them put a roundabout. It's not the best roundabout, but it is a roundabout. But then the people don't know how to do it, so I saw this poor little lady get up to it. What do I do? And she turned left. It's all right though. You're going 15, so it's not. Actually, you're probably going 10 because they got the pavers on it. Roundabouts are. I mean, they're great solutions. Your one-way roundabout, you can carry up to about 20,000 vehicles per hour. If you've got that many vehicles less entering the intersection, it works better than a signalized intersection. You get the 2 lanes, and that's a big roundabout, a 2-lane roundabout. You can carry about 40,000 vehicles per day through that intersection, and it's nice because it doesn't require a lot of stop, and the speeds are low enough that it's not a hostile environment. Crossings can be tricky for ADA purposes. The way England does that is they'll go back down the roundabout a little bit and they'll put a signal there so you can hit a pedestrian signal and cross it. It's taken me a while to come to roundabouts, but I'm pretty hot on this. What I'm really hot on is the traffic circle, residential traffic circles. Those things are awesome. I was trying to convince my neighborhood association and the local city down there to go for those, but they're just not ready for that.
Calming circles?
Huh?
Calming circles?
Yeah. Just drop it on. I mean, you go to Seattle and they just drop it in and people garden. It's a fantastic, fantastic thing.
Yeah, but it can be. There are 2 in Houston that are good examples of what not to do.
Yeah. There was a roundabout in Florida that's a good example of what not to do. They didn't want to put it in traffic like
Clearwater?
Parkland.
Yeah.
Yeah, you know. So it's like a 55-mile-per-hour rural road. They got an intersection there. They put it in. It's like the day they put that thing in, a motorcyclist tried to go through that. And getting from 55 to 15 in like 100 feet doesn't happen on motorcycles. They got a fatality that first day. It's a traffic signal now.
Well, there are also, and I'm on the ITD roundabout task force. There are a lot of roundabouts in the country that just aren't designed well.
Yeah.
And that's where they started getting their bad name. But if they're done well, they work extremely well.
They're real nice. Yeah. I'm with you on that.
So what's maximum speed on?
You can design them for different speeds, but you typically see them designed to go about 15.
So if I've got a 65-mile-an-hour highway coming into it?
That's not the kind of road you should be putting around about.
Okay, because I saw one in the side of nearby my neighbor's.
Yeah.
And I looked at it and put the damn stoplight and be done, right?
Yeah.
Actually, you can. FHWA issued a field directive in the summer of 2008 that reaffirmed that roundabouts are appropriate for rural conditions and ramp termini and freeways. You have to do proper geometry in advance to encourage the drivers to slow down, and they're working. Carmel, Indiana, which is a suburb of Indianapolis, in December built their 52nd roundabout. They now have more signals, and they are moving to eliminate all signals.
What time is this?
Carmel, C-R-M-E-L, it's not Carmel, it's Carmel. In 2011, the National Roundabout seminar is going to be held there.
No, I didn't know about this place. I'll have to look that up. That's interesting.
Okay, I was wondering if you could clarify at the beginning, there's two things you talked about that are pretty close related. One is sort of the historical, perfect square grid having disadvantages from the perspective of residential users and so on because of traffic being diffused. But then later talking about that the traditional network, because it diffuses the traffic, allows you to eliminate sort of the mobility problem of bottlenecks on your major roads. So I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit on the sort of tension between those two ideas and how to fix that. And then secondly, you talked about breaking up super blocks, and that's obviously very closely related to creating a more diffuse network. I'm wondering if you could add on any thoughts you have about sort of how you make the case for the value of breaking up those blocks. And specifically, the biggest reason why, because in a lot of places like this area in particular, the super blocks are deliberately created in order to try and disrupt this grid.
Right.
And so if you were to look back at those now and say we want to reopen those, how would you go about doing that?
Well, there are a couple pieces to this, and this is actually a fairly interesting question. We could spend a lot of time on this, so I'll try to get it short. The first is that the first issue is the safety effects of adding off network. Four-way intersections are more dangerous than cul-de-sacs for obvious reasons. They're more dangerous than three-leg intersections if you've got two streams of through-moving traffic. And they're tough. If you can keep speeds down to a certain level, it's not so bad. But in general, the more four-leg intersections you have, the higher the number of crashes you're going to have. And you see that across the board, which means you need to be clever about the way you design your street network. You need to interrupt long stretches of roadway to keep speeds down. Traffic circles are great for that reason. T-intersections. And actually, a lot of the stuff the urbanists are putting forward aren't strict grids. They're hybrid networks with a lot of T-intersections. T-intersections are fantastic. Because you got as many T-intersections as you want on the roadways out here, street network's going to get safer. Because the four-leg intersections will drive down your safety performance. Because your T-intersection forces one stream of traffic to stop, is the idea. So the network thing is a tough problem, actually, and it requires smart design. It requires more research to figure out what networks are optimal for different configurations. I spent a lot of time playing with that idea. And that's an area that I want to do more research on. The other issue is, what about the traffic itself? Are we going to just unload all of this traffic into the residential network so that kids can play with traffic again, and it's a wonderful situation? You still need mobility-oriented thoroughfares. I mean, you're still going to need higher capacity thoroughfares, but they don't have to be high speed. In fact, your best performing roadway is going to be about 30 miles an hour in terms of throughput, because it reduces the headways between vehicles. Now, if you look at your level of service chart, I don't have the speed volume inversion. Engineers get a little squishy about that because that's bordering down the level of service F range. But we measure level of service in terms of speed in parts. So the lower speed, you raise your level of service. But your throughput, if you're looking for efficiency, is better at about 30 miles an hour. And from a public sector perspective, when you're trying to provide efficient infrastructure with limited dollars, serving the greatest number of people is going to make the most sense. There's actually a really neat video that looks at traveling the average speed on YouTube as different simulations, and you'll see this in play. That as you get speeds go down, your operational performance on a roadway is great. What degrades your operational performance is actually these people that try to speed up, right? So they go from the average speed to a high speed and then slow back down because you wind up messing with the traffic flow theory. Anyway, YouTube, if you put in YouTube average speed, you'll see it. It's a beautiful simulation that shows you what happens with that. But your efficient roadway is going to be about 30 miles an hour. But you can carry a lot of traffic. I mean, you can carry 30,000, 40,000 vehicles per day easy on a roadway. Just design it to be accommodating to urban uses, which means keep the speeds down. Yeah?
with the road network, my question is like, how effective or how cost effective is it to build the grid streets on the existing structure? I mean, you keep on saying we're going to create livable streets.
Right.
One of the solutions is going to be by making them grid, but on
Making them great.
Grid
Grid networks.
structures, yeah, grid networks. So how cost effective is it to do it on the existing?
To add connections into the existing street network? My guess is that would be, I mean, it would be a contingent on your acquisition costs for additional properties to do that would be my guess. I mean, I guess it would be conditioned on land values in a given area.
Is it a doable thing? Because I mean, we're going through this.
Yeah, it'll be, and again, real estate land costs are something I'm not real smart. I'm good at drawing little pictures. And those who can do and those who can't teach, right? My guess is it could be, land acquisition costs could be pricey. Now, through the strategic acquisition of select parcels, you might be able to get more network. One thing to take advantage of actually is a lot of the stuff that gets built is built to be disposable, particularly on your arterials. So you've got these big retail parks, your Walmarts, right, or big parcels that you're going to be able to, and Walmart just walks away, right? And now you've got this land that's sitting idle. That's a prime opportunity. You can probably pick it up pretty cheap and redevelop it based on that. Existing residential neighborhoods are tough. They're probably even tougher in Houston than elsewhere because you guys are pretty stringent on your deed restrictions. But the big retail stuff is where your opportunities are for recreating things.
No, but Houston's been going the other way around. We've been taking off grid connections for the past 20 years. I bet we've lost 200 of them in Southwest Houston while I lived, since I've lived here in Houston.
Oh, wow.
You used to be able to drive down any street, and they blocked them all off for subdivisions. Our bribing city officials to take them out of their subdivision, even the ones that weren't created with nothing but cul-de-sacs are now closed off on every direction.
Well, how did they close them off? I mean, I guess they missed traffic coming. They put in.
Oh, they've gone from everywhere to actually building these humongous barriers to dirt mounds in them and planting trees in them. I mean, physically closing, making them impossible.
But the city still owns that, right?
Some of them the city owns, some of them the subdivision may have taken on.
But you're not going to have to take somebody's property, so there's not.
If the art belongs to the subdivision, you
Yeah.
can convince the morons that it maybe want to get the gas money back and drive them 2 miles
Yeah.
to the opposite side, who knows?
I mean, that's more undoable than kicking somebody out of their home and bulldozing it, and putting a street through it. You have more options
I don't
there.
know, nowadays,
Yeah.
I just dropping, you may get giveaways on the homes.
Yeah. Yeah.
We're about, the Houston California Council is about to actually modify the regional transportation plan and then start on the next regional transportation plan. And I wonder if you've thought about using some of this to analyze regional transportation plans or to actually use in developing the plan.
Oh, so for the long-range planning process?
Yeah.
Yeah, you can actually, and we did this as part of an NCHRP project, you can actually use, not so much the data in here, but you can develop off another paper, you can develop models that will allow you to forecast at the traffic analysis zone level the number of crashes you would expect to occur given different developmental configurations. I've modeled it at block group level, but you can do the same thing at the traffic analysis zone level, provided you have the data to do that. But yeah, that can absolutely be done. And there's a national movement to move towards what we call safety-conscious planning, which is to start bringing safety into the long-range planning process. I mean, if you guys are going to go forward with something like that, I'd love to be involved with that. I mean, I think it's important, and we haven't done a good job with it. Some places are trying to get this in place more. There's a national effort to do this. And the key is beginning to do things like you're saying, which is forecast traffic, or coming up with guidelines, evaluating the safety impacts of different types of facilities as they go in. Absolutely. I mean, I think that's critical. Yeah, no, I would love, if you're going to move forward with that, we should trade information offline. Absolutely.
Have you modeled public transport, safety impacts in it? And I know the Houston Rail has sort of been being the news with.
And other things too.
So do you have kind of a summary of which ones working, no?
Safety performance of public transportation.
No, well, they're mixed be
Yeah.
forever, right?
I mean, well, it's
So
gonna,
we put in the road,
right.
the rail downtown, and now cars and buses routinely run into rail, right, instead of running into each other.
No, all of them, it's not routine, it's rare.
Well, this year it's become more routine, I'm afraid, but, yeah.
Oh, they're going, because I know Houston, when I first moved here, I met with the Metro folks, and I asked this, and they actually showed me the stats. In their first year, I mean, crashes were through the roof, but they did a good job of retrofitting.
Nobody could figure out where you could turn and where
Yeah.
buses were and where around.
I guess
Also, people claim that it is okay to jump a red light in Houston. So there was a lady who said, "Oh, how could my father die? He was just jumping a red light." And
Oh, no kidding.
We weren't allowed to make a left turn.
Yeah, I guess the medical center is where they have the biggest problems here because they have to leave the emergency vehicle access and people try to take advantage of that for a turning location. I haven't seen, it's not that it doesn't exist, but I haven't seen statistics
I
on
was just curious
how it
whether
goes.
you put it in your own.
No, it's, well, you could do that. I mean, you would have to get data. You don't see a lot of transit. You'll see bus crashes. You don't see a lot of light rail crashes. San Antonio doesn't have light rail, so we don't have that. It'd be interesting to look at the Houston crash rate and see that. I haven't looked at that, but my guess is you could model it. It's still, compared to multiple vehicle crashes, it's going to be incredibly rare. I mean, you probably have at most 100 a year. I mean, it can't be that many. I mean, probably not even that many. Yeah.
Okay, guys, well, this will wrap up the sort of formal session we've got here, but I welcome you to stay around.